Thanks very much, Ria. Good morning. I think Ria was quite appropriate in saying good morning to our distinguished guests. I really think that the group that we have today, I think you are our distinguished colleagues, and some of you have just joined us into the University of Johannesburg, and you're coming from different parts of the world. So a very warm. It's not very cold in South Africa, so you can always use this expression. It's warm welcome to Johannesburg. By the way, it's not warm welcome to Johannesburg. I know that some of you also hear Johannesburg in different ways. I thought that I don't have a prepared speech, but I can prepare something afterwards if you want, in case you are interested in hearing some of the structured thoughts, as I did present also in this venue, and thanks very much to Kevin's excellent recording and also excellent editing, if I may say. So we do have something about the approach to expedite the journey for publications. I will probably talk a little bit about that, but I don't want to make that my prime angle of engagement. Linda indicated that I have about 30 minutes. I'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we can talk for maybe another 10. The first thing I want to talk about is my own experience in engaging with postdoctoral fellows. I've had the privilege of working with 4 postdoctoral fellows in the past. I did not have postdoctoral fellows that came from my own set of master's and PhD graduates, perhaps because a number of them were not all engaged in academia. Some of my PhD graduates moved on into other spaces, and I know that some of you may be contemplating the various spaces that the journey of a PhD then leads to, and one of them might be in the system of academia, it might be in the system of science councils or other similar avenues that enables you to continue the approach for creating new knowledge. So I had 4 postdoctoral fellows, 2 from South Africa and 2 from elsewhere, and it was a great experience for me because it also brought about a completely different angle, not only from a technical discipline point of view, but the different cultures that this brought into our research group. My own background is in the area of microelectronics, in electronic engineering, and some of our postdocs, also with visiting academics, came from other parts of the world, also from the continent, but also from other places such as China and from India. And these were also visiting researchers and not only postdoctoral fellows. But it brought about a beautiful blend in my research group, because it brought about a blend that took a particular problem and evaluated this from different perspectives. So in my own area of work, I want to give you this as an example, because sometimes, particularly if you have just completed a PhD, you are really in that depth. You have engaged the depth, but perhaps you have a breadth component and you have the depth, and you really engage in a very deep way. And sometimes to an extent that we don't realize that there's a depth just adjacent to us, or a depth in a completely different dimension that could have and solve a big problem that we may have. I want to give an examples of this. If you're not yet familiar with South Africa, Johannesburg, we host a number of interesting things, and one of them is we're also home to some of the deepest mines in the world. We have mines that go down as deep as 4 kilometers. The Tautona mines, for example. And you can immediately imagine, depending on which disciplines you come from and how you engage with that experience, you might be thinking about the temperature at that depth. You might be thinking about, is it people or is it machines? Who engages at that depth, depending on the temperatures that you might be getting? You may be thinking about the 4th Industrial Revolution, because it has maybe an opportunity to engage with those depths. But you may be thinking about it altogether differently. You may not even be thinking about it in the mining context. You may be thinking about it in terms of mining knowledge. One of the publications that resulted as a result of that mine was an article on unicellular organisms which are found, and it led to a publication in Nature. I don't think that the folks that were digging to that depth for looking for minerals were thinking about discovering unicellular organisms, but it led to a paper in the journal Nature. Of course, that was because this depth was willing to engage researchers from other communities. I think that's the first point that I want to bring about, is this aspect of multi and rather cross-disciplinary areas of research that brings about engagement in various ways. I have a student right now who's busy with his PhD, and he's working on detecting, so I told you my area was microelectronics, right? So he's working on microorganisms. Now he's working on stink bugs, and he's working on coconut bugs, and he's dealing with this problem of fruit produce that is, the yield is reduced due to the fact that the stink bugs and the coconut bugs understand the behavior, their behavioral pattern is not very well understood by entomologists. So coming from a background dealing with technology, we brought in a radar perspective, and these insects were tagged with some aluminum foil kind of structure. And so you can understand their behavioral pattern, and then you can determine how best to have trap crops as a green solution as opposed to insecticides. This student would probably publish not in a journal in electronics or microwave, he would probably publish in entomology economics or so. And then you would wonder whether I should be okay with that, because the narrow, as you've always been told, you should publish in that discipline. But for this student, it's a different journey. For this student, it's about impact it's about the application of engineering, and that is what he sees as his forte that would come about in a few years. So you have these different engagements, and I think we have to acknowledge that we will have this diversity of how people will develop their impact. So I perhaps also want to say that I know that sometimes when you're a postdoc, I know with my own postdocs, also other postdocs that I'd engaged with overseas, I picked up this conflict because you will be with a supervisor and you will have almost the determination of maybe wanting to become like the supervisor, and some of you might be wanting to be the opposite. I want to say that that's quite okay, because I think that we find our avenues of impact in different ways. And I think that if we are able to maximize that, we're able to find that we can make a difference in the way that we want to proceed. So that's my second point, is about these different avenues of impact. The third aspect is around, you are here and somebody would probably be engaging you. It might be a vice dean, might be a department head, might be a supervisor, and might be trying to commit you into a contract. Have you experienced this yet? Some kind of a performance contract in terms of how many units you must produce. And you feel very tensed about this, isn't it? Almost like a threat. I see some of you have these daggers over your head. They look virtual. I've got to 1.6. What am I going to do with the other 0.4? What would life be if I don't get it? So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know that it's a difficult experience. The first thing I want to say, and I must acknowledge that faculties and academic departments have diversity and are allowed some level of autonomy in the way that they operate. Because we are a university, if you take the aspect of autonomy away from the different departments, you put people on an escalator, you switch it off, and you hear them crying for help and not being able to exit or walk up. So we do need that some level of autonomy. At the same time, we have to be realistic. Dr. Matwisha has to do a financial balancing together with our finance business partners every year, and she has to come up with an income model which is sustainable so that we can continue to grow those who we collaborate as postdoctoral colleagues or fellows. So what I had worked with my own postdocs, and I must say that they have become quite successful. Some are academics, some are not academics, but they're still quite successful. This experience that I would share is more for the academic or for people that have been with the Science Council track, where they were very much about developing a research team. And it's complex because you are working with a supervisor and you are part of this research team. And so you have a shared identity. But at the same time, and in some disciplines you publish alone, that's the norm of the discipline. In other disciplines you co-publish with your supervisor, and depending on which discipline you are with, especially if you're in that model with the co-supervisor, you might also be feeling like wanting to have your own identity, because you might come from an area with a postdoctoral track or a doctoral track, and that might lead to some tensions. I will say that in my own discipline, it is a norm to have a co-authorship with your supervisor, but there must be intellectual input or authorship input as part of that contribution. But it's a complex domain, because for myself, I realized that the postdoctoral fellow that I was working with was also, I needed to make sure that at the end of that 2-year experience, this person needed to move on, maybe even to a position of associate professor, and maybe almost immediately. But remember, the norm in my area was to have this co-authored approach. So I needed to have an approach where I could divorce myself to give the other person an independent identity, but in the journey build a long-term relationship. And it's not easy for supervisors to, because we are all, you see, we are measured in a way of these units, and this is whole financial math that happens behind the scene. So what could you do? Because you may be in that difficulty. Maybe, by the way, it's not always a difficulty. Sometimes it's a very fortunate space to be in that partnership, because that co-authorship opens up avenues for you and opens your identity in worlds that may know you less. So it's not necessarily only a tension, but it could be a very positive thing as well. So in this approach of building a research team, I would look at this vertical integration. So that's my third point, is the vertical integration between what happens at senior undergraduate levels, at honors level, at master's, and at PhD, and for you to almost fight for a space to co-supervise some of those students, and maybe have an approach where that co-supervision eventually changes to you being the lead supervision of that process. Because somewhere along the line you would be applying for an NRF rating, and you know, the role of the supervisor is what counts, not necessarily the co-supervisor. So you may have to have this model where you almost transit during the process, but to have a very good understanding with the student, so that the student sees you as a team. I want to talk about that word student as well. I admit that I'm using it right now, but I must say, within an environment of dealing with a research problem, I have personally never seen my students as a student, because, you know, I have a thought, I share this thought. It's probably a problem I have not been able to solve for some years. This is detail. Sometimes you must not say that. And you engage with this person. This person takes a strong ownership to your problem. And so I have often seen my students as a member, as really an equal participant in that research team. It has worked for me. I'm in very strong, I had, I think, about 9 books published in the last 2 years. And my formal doctoral graduates, I think we continue to collaborate. I don't think that they have realized they have finished their doctorate. I don't think that I realized that I have finished my role as a supervisor. But because we never had that role, we worked as a team. And I think it will be the case for probably forever. You know, we continue there somewhere in industry, and we are having a model of growing an academic in industry, which is very interesting for me. We haven't explored that in the past. Linda is giving me the 3-minute warning, right? 2 minutes. It's 1. Fingers are moving, eh? So I think, so I would leave it at that. I think that the vertical integration and managing that experience in the environment that you are in, even though it may create some opportunities and some difficulties. Remember, opportunity is nowhere, is just a bad way of saying opportunity is now here. You have to work together and shift the gaps, and sometimes with your supervisor, sometimes with department heads. And so that would be my third point. So multidisciplinary, building the impact, and then the aspect of this vertical integration, building a research team in the university, but also with collaborators outside. And perhaps as a result of this, you may have more research outputs. But I think we need to think about it as a result of what we would do rather than the outputs only being the end goal. But please do stick to those, as far as possible, to stick to those contracts that you're doing, because Linda would scold me if I don't say that. Thank you very much to all of you.
Yeah, I'm Cindy, postdoc at the Center for Social Change. I'm a French politist. So, you said you published 9 books in the last 2 years. So could you give us your 3 main advices to overcome fears in order to succeed in academic writings?
My question is regards career progression. And is there space within Johannesburg, UJ, not just within the department, that postdocs can move, can see that, okay, I can look around within UJ?
I thought you'll have many, so I started to type what you were overcoming the writing fear. So I want to say, remember when I started, I talked about the intellectual input. I did not only say authorship input. I want to say something about that sometimes we are very good at thoughts, but not always very good in writing. And sometimes we are very good at experimentation, depending on what discipline you're working in. So I think when you have to build your, by the way, some of these books were with teams of 4 or 5, so it was not one man. Please don't ask me to send you 300 times 9, if you know. But it was also about this team with people with different strengths. So some were very experimental, others were much more computer simulation based, some may be more input based. I do like to write. I wake up every morning at about 3 in the morning because I like to write. And I do that between 3 and 5. It is a very important intellectual engagement for me, because for me writing is not about writing, it's about reflecting my mind and seeing whether the peer review people have a similar reflection or can help me build on a different reflection. So in my case, writing is that journey. But your question was about how do you overcome the fear? I'm sorry, Cindy, you didn't tell me your discipline. Political. Ah, you see? It explains, that explains, right? Because I know that the people in the sciences, the maths, you must be wondering, what is this thing about this fear? Because you are in a discipline which can be very heavily contested. In terms of very strong thought bodies that can have that, right? So I would suggest that, so maybe I'll give you an example. So I have a PhD student who's working, a PhD, let's say collaborator, because it's an interesting model that he's working on a system of innovation. By the way, he's going to contemplate that the South African system of innovation, which we spent a lot of money and time and so on, is he's going to contest that it is not a good model. And he's going to put it very, very straightforward. He has a very simple and very simple to understand, that it is 20 years since the system of innovation has been developed, and the outcomes of the system does not match what has been put from an input side. Very simple. You can't really argue with that, right? However, it will be evaluated by the very people who have created that system of innovation. So it will now become a heavily contested, and I, in fact, so what I suggested to him, and he is, and I very much respect that he does bring about this very extreme in his approach, and what I suggested to him was we have to access people who will have a completely different thought to what you have. We don't want to disconnect with them. We want to access with them. We want to have an access point to them. And so his approach is now, it has molded to it has evolved, rather say, to a hybrid system of innovation, which takes into account some of those, even though in his view may be very limited, gains of the system of innovation, to then depart from that centralized system to a decentralized system, and he changes the weighting factor to 20% of what currently exists to 80% of what he thinks should be, to 80% of his approach, which then manages, which is then becomes his hypothesis, that he is then collecting data and testing resourcing and mindsets and all the things that goes with that. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if it's the actual writing that is a problem, or if it's the fact that what you put forward will meet heavy contestation. Or is it both?
The writing, I think.
It's the actual writing. Yeah. So perhaps you should look at developing, a group and seeing if you can put down your ideas and see whether you can have some others who are, of course, duly acknowledged on any writing as an author, or acknowledged depending on the type of contribution, so that I don't really see things as a strength or as a weakness, but writing is like exercising. If you look at, I used to be in a complex and some time ago with an athlete who used to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and run. And so when I said you have to sometimes wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and write, it's not very different to that mold of exercising, that you do have to exercise and keep fit. So the more that you do, the more you realize that you can do. Second part was about the career progress within the university. So the University of Johannesburg, of course, funds the postdoctoral program through subsidy that we derive from government, but at the same time, we also take recognition that we are a university in the wider system of universities in South Africa. So we also know that for us, it's not a negative thing if a person completes their postdoctoral experience in this system and moves into another system ideally within the system of universities in South Africa. Of course, we would love that priority to be with the University of Johannesburg, because we also see this as a start of a journey that builds a relationship of a long time. And you may find that this may not only be in South Africa, but also abroad. Now, what I would suggest is that if you are a person and you realize you can there are two ways of getting things done. One, you can leave it to chance, and the other, which I don't think is a good strategy, by the way, and the other is you can design a coincidence. I would suggest the second approach. I know I've used an oxymoron there, but I think it's possible. One of my own doctoral students will now go into a place where he has created a job as a result of his experience. He has been able to get into an avenue where he will demonstrate that he's going to save certain farmers certain amounts of money by having an experiment around these fruits. And he said, it's okay, you can use and do this. I just want a 0.5% agreement with the University of Johannesburg on the surplus that you will gain as a result of what you will save. And then you suddenly realize that you have changed that into a different gain. So that aspect of impact, I don't think it's only in the SET. I think in the humanities, it can also be as powerful in the social sciences, as a lot of solutions are not, a lot of technological solutions don't implement because of the fact that we don't work across the disciplines. We have water on the continent, middle of the continent, but it doesn't flow. It doesn't bring us hydropower, not because of the lack of water or technology, but because of the politics related to water. That's a very complex problem on its own. So that's what I would say is try to design avenues of being able to get external funding, and perhaps also start a cost center while you're at the university, so that you can, you finish your postdoctoral fellow experience and you move on to a research fellow which is funded, right? That's like firing your boss.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ebenezer by name with the Center for Telecommunication. Prof, I have some pressing questions. One is, you talked about a postdoc generating 2 units. But you notice when we got this contract, it was not specifically stated, even if when some of us got more than 2 units. So I'm worried. I want a situation where the 2 units should be stated and the message should be passed across, because I got to know that I need to produce 2 units from a colleague. So I wanted the school or the university to make it more explicit so that we know our target. 1, 2. You talked about there's this drive now for book publishing. Now, like I said in my previous question, the book publishing is not still clear. Are we producing monograph or textbook for a particular subject? And if we are, what is the reward for somebody who produced a book with respect to somebody who just produced a journal paper? So I think there should be a reward for hard work, because I don't know if you understand my question. Yeah, thank you.
You want to thank you message. There were 2 questions there. We have run out of time, so are there any other questions that we take, or no?
One
short answer. So in terms of, I think something has gone wrong in the correspondence when you have been hired, because the letter that goes out from the university should indicate the 2 units. However, we must just understand what does it mean, because it will mean it should be it's together with your supervisor as the minima. So it's supervisor postdoctoral, because we don't want you to have a divorced approach, for example, with the supervisors. That's, I think, is important to understand. But ideally, you have to build your footprint. So if you are able to get that 2 units as a net result of your journey, then that would be the most optimal approach. Each of the departments are required to do a performance contracting every year. But they may not spell 2 units just as is, because you may be working in the Department of Geology where they may be working on a publication in Nature for which you have to do a certain number of things which will lead to that publication in a 1.5 years time. So your supervisor plus department head plus yourself will take that nuance into account. By the way, we want you to publish in Nature and in Science and in Harvard Business. We welcome that. If you don't meet your 2 units and you have published in Nature, this is okay. Absolutely acceptable. So I hope that helps you in building a deal on that one. The next one is about incentive, and I appreciate that you're actually asking for the financial incentive component relating to books. Let's think about that, because there's no secret that we are moving over into a books arena, because it does bring us more income. But you have to also be very careful on managing the books versus journal, because you might find yourself driving the books one side, great, excellent, please do it. But on the other side, in your discipline, you may find that the model of books is not what is needed to progress you academically. So in certain disciplines globally, you will find that journals is what counts. And you have to think from a global perspective. Really, you have to think from a global perspective. Because policies change. 2003, the books were not recognized in the same way. So if I was hiring you, I will look at your journal outputs only. So try to have an approach which is balanced, not only from a financial component, but one that gives you the maximum credibility in 5 to 10 years, subject to your discipline.
Okay, Prof, my name is Amma. I'm from CSIR. Just a suggestion. I was attending should I call it a meeting or a conference when science directors were around? they were discussing about open access and closed access. But I know precisely when you are publishing, your supervisor says you shouldn't publish open access. But in this meeting I attended, they were advising us seriously that we should publish open access. One, it gives a very broad form for everyone to read your work. So we asked a lot of questions there, and they could not actually answer it. So I'm just suggesting that if they can raise a fund from PDRF to support our publication for open access.
I think we should have a session specifically on a publication strategy itself. And I think that's probably, I think it's the next session that's going to be planned. It's going to be specifically PDRF, your publication strategy. Maybe that would be.
Yeah, so the library is going to have a discussion on this topic, but I'm going to answer your question in 1 second, which is an avenue to do both. Because you can take a closed publication into the institutional repository, and post the embargo period which exists, you find that your publication is made available on an open access platform.